There's been a change in plans with regard to Detroit at the state level. They were thinking actually about paying Detroit $350 million over 20 years, but it occurred to them that a lump sum payment might be a better idea. So they basically made a net present value calculation and came up with $195 million to bail out, or partially bail out, the city of Detroit as part of a grand bargain that would see pensioners taking a smaller haircut than they otherwise would, saving the artwork at the Detroit Institute of Arts and helping the emergency manager get more money to get Detroit out of bankruptcy faster. Because it's only $195 million, and I say only, the idea for selling just one painting came to us because we think that the DIA ought to contribute more. Detroit has effectively made its own fiscal bed, and we think it's incumbent upon Detroit then to lay in it. There's no reason to waylay, to Shanghai Michigan taxpayers from across the state into the Detroit transaction when they were never party to it. They didn't vote for the leadership that made decades of bad economic decisions. They didn't vote for the leadership that ignored fiscal storm clouds on the horizon. And they certainly didn't twice elect Kwame Kilpatrick, who was indicted on 24 federal felony counts and who put together a pension deal during his term that helped tip Detroit into bankruptcy in the first place. There are competing alternatives for state dollars. The number one issue on people's minds today is our bad roads. We need to improve the infrastructure. And I think it offends a lot of taxpayers to see money that could go to filling potholes in Ishpeming or in Traverse City or in Saginaw basically end up protecting highbrow art in the city of Detroit, particularly when that municipality should have bailed itself out with wiser policies. I think taxpayers also recognize that by bailing out the city, they're rewarding bad behavior instead of punishing bad behavior. If you subsidize something, and in effect we're subsidizing Detroit's bad fiscal policy choices, you get more of it. If the government subsidized wheat, we would get more wheat. It's very, very reasonable and logical to assume that we'll be actually subsidizing more of these problems in the future, whether it is Detroit or other cities, by bailing out Motown. I don't think taxpayers want to see that either. They also recognize the inherent unfairness of the entire equation, not only because they've been forced to bail out a city, but because in this particular instance, creditors are being given short shrift. People have loaned money to the city of Detroit with the expectation that Detroit would live within its means and pay them back for that investment. If things go the way they're going, and creditors don't get a fair treatment in the bankruptcy process, it will be more expensive, not just for Detroit to borrow money going forward, but probably other units of government in Michigan as well. A bad case precedent is being set here, and it should not be set, because it'll cost many of us in terms of additional borrowing costs for our own cities. If this passes as introduced, there will be an oversight committee for Detroit that lasts 20 years. So they're going to have state appointees looking over the shoulder of Detroit leadership for 2 decades on fiscal questions because they don't want to see this happen again. They don't want Chapter 9 to become Chapter 18. There have been 4 surveys done of public opinion with regard to bailing out the city of Detroit. And each of those surveys has ended up with different results, and we think that's a function of the way the question is asked. The Mackinac Center actually hired a company to do a survey for its own purposes. We asked very specifically, do you support a bailout of the city of Detroit to the tune of $350 million over 20 years? The vast majority of Republicans and independents said, no, we're not interested in that whatsoever. The polls that were more favorable towards the idea of a bailout had far more positive narratives and in fact avoided the word bailout, even though the dictionary definition of what's going on here is bailout. This is an important thing to consider when you see all the headlines. It depends on how the question is asked, and other polls that have done would have written far more positive narratives to be read to the people who are answering the polls. We think our poll is more accurate gauge of how Michigan feels on balance towards using taxpayer money everywhere to bail out a city that has followed its own nest.